Yeah, so next slide.
Oh, yeah.
So I'll just quickly introduce you to this panel session. The abstract is the increasing role of computation in today's society requires us to go beyond computer science courses to integrating computational tools and practices within disciplinary contexts. However, we know little about what integration looks like in primary, secondary, and university classroom. So in this panel, we'll share perspectives on the importance of developing knowledge of computation in a digitized world and how it could be integrated within disciplinary contexts. In particular, we'll discuss what embedding computation looks like at the elementary, secondary, and university level, and how it can support disciplinary learning. And then there's a link to the conference paper. Yeah, and next one. And this is who we are. Tor Ole Odden is a postdoc at the University of Oslo. Aman Yadav is a professor at Michigan State University. Katrine Wallström Tellefsen is a senior lecturer at the University of Oslo. And I'll be moderating this session. I'm a PhD student at the Danish School of Education, Aarhus University. Yeah. And the panel structure is as follows. I don't want to say a lot about this slide, but yeah, I'm introducing the panel. And then we have 3 presentations from Aman Yadav, Katrine Wallström Tellefsen, and Tor Ole Odden. And in the end, we have an interactive question and answer session. Yeah. And next one. So first of all, why do we need computer science education? Computation has become increasingly important to modern life, both professionally and personally, and the knowledge of programming and computational methods dramatically increases employability, it unlocks new career opportunities, and it is becoming increasingly critical, also for non-technical positions. Additionally, with the increasing digitization of modern life, this basic understanding of computation is becoming more and more necessary to participate in our modern-day democratic society. So for this reason, educators, researchers, and policymakers have argued for the necessity to train students in computational thinking as part of their general education. And in order to achieve this goal, we need to broaden access to computational ideas and practices and tools, not only as a singular subject or domain, but also through the educational system at all levels, from primary school through university, and integrated across disciplines. Yeah. And what does that mean in practice? It means that adapting and scaffolding computational ideas so that they can be implemented early in elementary school or before, and then gradually developed until students have achieved a basic level of computational literacy by the time they have completed high school. And this will require a systemic change across several dimensions: teacher education, curriculum design, policies and standards, and teaching methods. And so that is what the 3 panelists will discuss in a few minutes at the 3 different educational levels that I already mentioned. And they'll unpack the essential challenges and opportunities to integrate computation at each level, discuss the importance of integration within their context, and how they have scaffolded teacher learning of computational practices using unplugged and plugged approaches. Yeah. So the need of learning CT is actually not a new idea. These questions have been examined and discussed for about 60 years. For example, a Danish professor called Peter Nauer already said in the 1960s that all of us have had to learn a considerable amount of languages, arithmetic, and mathematics in school, without many of us subsequently becoming linguists or mathematicians. In the same way, we must bring computer science into the school and prepare ourselves for life in the era of the computers, just as reading and writing are regarded as necessary prerequisites for life in a society characterized by the printed word. And now I propose a subject for compulsory education that involves not only the programming of computers, but also other skills and competencies, such as computational design and understanding algorithms. Yeah. And in a paper written with Aman Yadav, we point out that educating teachers to teach computer science concepts has also been discussed since early 1970s. For example, a Danish professor called Alan Malmberg argued that lack of preparing teachers trained in datalogy, which is the Danish word for computer science, remained a choke point to embed it in the primary and secondary education. And even back then, researchers argued for the need for computer scientists and educators to work together to bring relevant topics and terminology into primary and secondary classrooms, given that teachers, rather than computers, are the ones that teach programming. And even today, there is a problem of qualified teachers who are prepared to teach computer science concepts. So now it's time to listen and learn from these historical experiences and make sure that a lack of teacher education is not a choke point. And teaching computer science is exactly what Aman and Katrine and Thor will discuss in this session. Yeah. And next one. First one is Aman Yadav, who will talk about the elementary level. Aman is a professor in the College of Education at Michigan State University. He focused on developing teacher competencies to teach computer science at the elementary level. Aman will present one of the National Science Foundation projects he leads called CT for EDU, on scaffolding teachers' integration of computer science ideas in their classroom. And he will discuss the challenges teachers face and discuss the role of computational thinking in elementary classroom. He'll describe how focusing on broad conception of computational thinking practices can allow teachers to see the relevance of computer science within their classrooms, and he'll share case studies of teachers using coding tools and platforms to engage their students in learning mathematics and science at the elementary level. Yeah, and Aman.
Okay. Can I share?
Yeah, you can take over.
Okay. Everybody sees a blank screen for now. Everybody can see that? All right. So thanks, Eliza, for that introduction, and hello, everybody. So I'm a professor in the College of Education at Michigan State. For the last several years, I've been involved in computer science education with a particular focus on preparing teachers to either teach computer science as a standalone subject at the secondary level, or which is in the US is grades 9 through 12, or integrate computational thinking, computer science at the primary and middle school level, so grades K through 8. And so this work has spanned pre-service and in-service teacher level, from elementary to secondary. Today I'm going to talk about one of those projects, CT for EDU, as Eliza said, where we've been working with teachers in the Metro Detroit area here in Michigan to integrate computational thinking in elementary classrooms. Over these last several years, the work, as I said, has focused both on pre-service and in-service teacher level. One of the first projects was CS for EDU, where we worked to integrate computational thinking into core teacher education courses, so teachers were prepared to become computationally educated secondary teachers. Another project, PD for CS, was focused on providing just-in-time online professional development support to teachers who are teaching the computer science principles course for the first time, and more recently the CT for EDU project, which is focused on the elementary level. So just to give a little background about the trajectory of CS education efforts in the US. In 2008, the National Science Foundation started an ambitious effort to have computer science taught in 10,000 schools by 10,000 well-qualified teachers. And that work led to the CS Principles course, as well as the several other courses, such as the Exploring Computer Science, since then Code.org, Project Lead the Way, and a number of other curriculum providers have expanded access to computer science in the US. So now we've shifted to CS for all. So everybody gets opportunity to learn computing but how do we achieve CS for all? One of the ways that we have thought about achieving CS for all is to start at the elementary level. So teachers and kids get to understand what it means to think computationally, using both unplugged CT approaches as well as plugged CT approaches. Given that elementary school teachers have a lot on their plates and they do a lot, just saying that, oh, we also want you to teach coding is always not as attractive, especially in the US, where there's such a heavy focus on testing of math and literacy, which become the priority of a lot of schools. So we thought about integrating computational thinking into math and science in our work with teachers in Oakland schools here in Michigan. The CT4 EDU approach is a researcher-practitioner partnership. So unlike a typical linear approach to educational research, in which researchers are the one who conceptualize and design and implement a study of interest to them, RPP, a researcher-practitioner partnership, involves working with the school district, the teachers, and the leadership of the school to figure out how to best integrate computational thinking within their classroom instruction. So we've used that approach so teachers engage in iterative cycles of design, implementing, testing, and redesigning what integration of CT looks like across different settings, given that we're working with about 6 to 8 school districts here in Oakland schools. So our broad goal for this work is to focus on broadening participation in computing by integrating CT in the elementary class, and then and focus on to what extent minoritized students have access to opportunities to engage in computational thinking. So we've used network improvement communities as our part of this work, which is cyclical and carried out by both educators and researchers together working in partnerships. So we started in fall of 2017, where we looked at schools that we wanted to work with. So we're working with schools that have high population of Black and Brown students, or students who are economically disadvantaged or have English as a second or are ELL learners. We try to build a community around the work we're doing, so there's trust and respect, and teachers are really seen as partners because they bring a lot of expertise to the table that we as researchers don't have. We've led teachers in Summer Institute, and then in the process of collecting data over the last couple of years. So one of the things that we did in this work, we did a root cause analysis where we met for a Saturday to talk to teachers about what are some of the opportunities and challenges that might exist to integrate computational thinking in their classroom. Overall, these 5 challenges emerged from that work. Of course, not surprisingly, teachers wanted knowledge and support to integrate CT into their classrooms. They also talked about how could they motivate students to engage in not only computational practices, but also the focus on math, literacy, and then science. Another challenge they talked about was addressing variety of learning levels, given that a classroom might have up to 30 kids in a classroom. So how do you ensure that everybody's getting opportunities to engage in computing? Engaging parents as partners, so parents understood why teachers are doing computational thinking or integrating computational thinking. One of the biggest challenges that came was, as I said earlier, was focus on testing in the U.S. So teachers have to focus on math and literacy, especially at the elementary grade. So how do we overcome that and still try to integrate CT? So we focus on 4 CT ideas: abstraction, which is about reducing complexity or identifying general principles that can be applied across situation; We focus on decomposition, about managing complex tasks by breaking them down. We focus on patterns. So how can teachers engage their students in patterns, both recognize and form patterns? And we focused on debugging. How can that be used as an approach to finding and fixing errors? So that was something the teachers really took on and applied, and students applied in math context especially. We work with teachers to co-design lessons where we ask them to think about ways CT might already be embedded in those lessons and ways it could be made explicit in those lessons. In our professional learning, we engaged our teachers as learners to introduce computational thinking ideas. So we both use non-content based, so just generic CT activities using both unplugged and plugged tasks, so they get to experience what does it mean to think computationally. For example, using a scratch activity, or dash and dot, which are robotic toys, where teachers thought about, in this case, as you can see in picture, the teachers are trying to program this little dash robot to go through a maze, so naturally it brings up mathematical ideas of angles and things like that. What's interesting in this picture is that before teachers even touch the robot and program the robot, they programmed a human. As you can see, both of those groups are doing that. So there's a lot of embodied thinking going on as well. So we wanted to show you a quick example of how teachers took CT and applied that within their classroom. So my grad student, Katie Rich, we published a couple of papers on how and looking at teacher profiles. So here's an example of how one teacher implemented CT. So it's a short little video. I'm going to play it here. The context is the students have been working on a task to make paper rockets that can be launched with rubber bands. And so this is the context of the lesson and then how she uses that language.
Okay. You are going to be working with your same groups, and the reason is because you're going to have a chance to test your hopper popper, the one you already made, and then you're going to have a chance to fix your hopper popper, okay? Looking up at my CT wall, after we test our hopper popper and we get a chance to fix it, raise your hand if you see what CT skill we're going to be using when we're trying to fix our hopper popper. Anna, what CT skill?
Debugging.
Debugging. How'd you know debugging?
Because it says finding errors, finding and fixing errors on the screen.
Very good. So you're going to be looking, while you're testing this first round, you're going to be looking for any mistakes that you might have made or things that you could fix about your hopper popper to make it work.
So I think, so I love that when a little girl says debugging, right? So it's the power of language that kids are using this in the science lesson here, and then they translate that to when they use computationally rich coding activities as well.
Okay.
So we did interviews with some of the teachers at the end of the year, once they had gone through a year of both professional learning experiences as well as implementing it. So teachers really thought of CT as a problem solving approach that engaged students in higher level thinking, but it gives them a better framework for thinking aspects. So here's Mary in third grade talking about that idea. One of the ways teachers thought that CT was a great way to enhance their classroom instruction. So here's Cassandra, who's a fifth grade teacher, talking about how CT strengthened her ability to actually teach problem-solving skills and to understand what kids are thinking and how they're working through problems, and trying to capture that. They also thought that CT. Here's another example. Again, they're saying that CT is a better framework for thinking aspects. It's just much more focused on problem-solving skills and trying to hear how students are approaching problems in the classroom. Another teacher, a couple of teachers said that teaching CT made teaching easier for them. So for some reason, even though our broader goal is to use these unplugged CT approaches as an on-ramp to more computationally rich experiences, teachers really like this idea of CT as a problem-solving skill. That's something they were hungry for, and then allowed them to teach the content. In terms of impact on students, our teachers talked about it increased students' ability. It raised their ability to problem solve because of making these skills explicit, and it also increased student confidence, right? So one of the things that came up, that students were more perseverant when they're solving a problem, because the idea of debugging gave them a language that it's okay if they don't get a problem right the first time, they can go back and fix it. What's interesting here is when teachers moved on to using plugged activities, here's Cassandra again talking about just having that experience of CT and the language gave her more confidence when she moved to plugged activities. But she also saw that the students were using the CT language within those plugged activities, and they were just not just playing around. So I think that was powerful, that kids were able to translate the language from unplugged activities to more plugged activities. And it also enhanced content learning, right? So that's Brian here talking about how using a Scratch program gave kids to see that their practice comes to life, and they could modify and change, and they could iterate on that. And so I think that was another powerful example of how plugged CT was valuable, or the teachers found plugged CT to be valuable. And so I'm going to quickly summarize here because I'm a couple minutes over my time. So teachers found CT to be a valuable tool to engage students in higher level thinking, problem solving, cross-disciplinary thinking. They thought CT had a positive impact on their teaching. They could help teach content, allow students to be more perseverant, be more confident. And they thought that unplugged CT was a valuable first step before moving on to plugged CT. And students were able to transfer the language from unplugged to plugged contexts. So thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions later. And here's my email address if people have any questions or want to learn more about the project. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Saman, for concrete examples on how you and your research group are working on implementing computational thinking in elementary schools. And if any of you have questions to Aman, we have this 15 minutes Q&A after the 3 presentations. So next presenter is Katrine Wallström Tellefsen. Could you put up my slides again?
I'm doing it right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Katrine is a senior lecturer at the Center for Computing in Science Education at the University of Oslo in Norway. In August 2020, a couple of months from now, a new Norwegian school curriculum will be implemented, including computing as an integrated part of the mathematics, natural science, music, and art crafts education. And the University of Oslo has taken a leading role in in-service teacher training for meeting the requirements of the new curriculum. Katrine will briefly introduce us to the Norwegian school system and the curriculum renewal, and with practical examples, she will present how teacher training is conducted, and she'll address the design of learning goals, political intentions, teachers' needs, and future aspects. Unfortunately, Katrine cannot be here today, but she has pre-recorded her talk, and Thor will play it from his computer.
Let's see, Kay, could I share my screen? There we go. All right.
I am Katrine Tellefsen and I work at the University of Oslo. Here I work with in-service and pre-service teacher training in math and physics. I'm also responsible for the faculty professional development. I have written several textbooks for upper secondary school in science and physics, and I have also worked 15 years as a math and physics teacher in the Norwegian school system at the upper secondary level. So, in recent years, programming has been a foundational skill that all students need to know. In Norway, the Department of Education has determined that programming should be included all the way from primary through upper secondary school. And so this fall, in August, we will implement a new national curriculum. Here, the programming is meant to strengthen the learning in the different subjects. Hence, the programming is not a separate course, but it will be included in the existing math and science and music and arts and crafts courses. This is in accordance with the critics of the transfer hypothesis as mentioned by Denning and Tedre in 2019. Finding that after much detailed investigation, education researchers eventually concluded there is not enough evidence to accept the transfer hypothesis, implying that learning to program does not transfer to knowing how to program in science and math. Mark Gustial shared the same thoughts in his blog. Learning to program in science class probably won't transfer without a bunch of work to programming in mathematics class. Before I move on to how we design then the teacher training at the University of Oslo, you need to know a little bit about the Norwegian school system. So our school system is 13 years. It's year 1 to 7 is primary school, and year 8 to 10 is lower secondary school, and year 11 to 13 is upper secondary school. So this means that the Norwegian students, they will be 19 years old when they finish. So the last year of physics in the Norwegian school system is similar to that of the first year of college in the United States. The teachers need training in order to meet the demands of the new curriculum. So we have designed 5 learning goals. First of all, they need some programming skills, and also they need to know more about computational thinking. And of course, how to teach this in math and science, the pedagogical issues. Then there is how they can use scientific programming and apply it to the existing curriculum. And finally, how the scientific programming can change the subject and new applications. Let me give a couple of examples on how we see programming fitting into existing subjects like math and science. And I'm starting with the last one, the number 5. In my discipline of physics, we often tell students to neglect air resistance. However, with programming, we no longer have to make this simplification. A much used model of air resistance is setting the force proportional to the speed squared. This can be analytically solved as a differential equation, although many students struggle with this level of math, especially at the pre-college level. With programming, we can use iterations instead, allowing the students to explore many different models for the air resistance after only a single semester of preparation, and develop their understanding through experimentation and inquiry. We can also use programming to solve well-known mathematical problems like the quadratic equation. Most students learn the formula for the quadratic equation and become proficient in how to plug the different constants into the algorithm in order to get the solutions. But when the students have to program the quadratic equation, they need to consider more carefully the actual meaning of the radicand, the bit under the root sign. A PhD student at a neighboring university has been studying this example, and he has seen that when having to write this program, the students actually obtain a deeper understanding of the quadratic equation. Although we have an idea of what we want to accomplish, we have another major challenge. Most Norwegian math and science teachers do not know how to program, meaning that the new curriculum leaves us with 40,000 math and science teachers in need of extra training in scientific programming and computational thinking. Norway has a fairly small population, but we are spread over a wide geographical area. Our Ministry of Education decides on a new curriculum and provides funding for in-service teacher training. However, it is hard to reach all the teachers with on-campus teacher training, especially in places like northern Norway or rural areas. It is too time-consuming to travel to all these small places. Thus, we need to think smart when it comes to designing the in-service teacher training and make a model that can be scaled up. We have designed two different models for teacher training, both including free online resources, and both models emphasizing that learning how to teach scientific programming and computational thinking requires collaboration and a safe learning environment. The first model is a full course enrolling up to 40 teachers at a time. Upper secondary school teachers come to campus for half-a-day course 4 times during a half-year period. Lower secondary teachers have a similar program, but they get 6 meetings on campus. In between the meetings, they are expected to work on their skills and understanding. Since there are a limited number of spaces and each school is offered only 3 slots, we encourage the teachers to spend time teaching their colleagues. They can also try out some tutorials in class, either tutorials made by us or designing their own. We also encourage them to reflect on the tasks and tutorial afterwards and send us notes on how it went. Last school year, we ran 4 classes with lower secondary teachers and 4 classes with upper secondary teachers. That is a lot of teaching, but still we are far from what is needed. The second model is a one-day course. This is meant as a let your guard down course for all those who are intimidated by the new curriculum. Many teachers who have had no experience with programming are anxious about the new curriculum and are not yet willing to commit to the time to do the full course. So this one-day course gives them a taste of programming in math and science and hopefully makes them curious enough to consider how this can be part of their teaching. With these 2 models, we have so far trained a little over 1,000 teachers. However, we are very far from the 40,000 in need. Thus, we need to develop a model that is scalable for the whole country. Our eventual goal is to make ourselves obsolete and turn the training over to the teachers themselves. As more teachers gain competence in scientific programming, they can themselves lead the teacher training in their district or school with the aid from our free online resources. To sum up, teacher training in scientific programming needs to address several learning goals. The teachers need to learn both how to program and how to teach this in a way that stimulates computational thinking. They need to understand how they can use programming as one of many representations of known problems and how programming opens up for the new and previously inaccessible problems. They need to learn how to stimulate tinkering, exploration, and collaboration as part of the learning process, and how this way of working with the subject can provide the students with a toolbox that is valuable beyond the sciences. And they need to have the resources and experience to train their colleagues across the country. So, where are we now? We have recently received funding for in-service teacher training of 240 more teachers in the full course program and 600 teachers for the one-day preparation course. In addition, we are developing online resources for all Norwegian math teachers from year 1 to year 10 on behalf of the Norwegian Department of Education. These resources are designed for local professional development at each school and will be launched in a few weeks' time. But we have many questions. First of all, do our courses really prepare the teachers for the classroom? Do teachers manage to both learn programming and how to teach programming and computational thinking? Do they gain the necessary confidence to use this in their teaching? We believe that if we do this the right way, scientific programming will provide deeper learning, but is this true? And if so, what are the crucial steps or conditions for this to happen? Do we actually manage to strengthen our math and science education with this approach? Are the students who are exposed to this approach actually becoming more creative and more motivated and prepared for the future, which are some of the arguments from the politicians and researchers? Well, many questions in the end there, but I thank you for your attention, and please do not hesitate to contact me for further discussions or exchange of experiences about in-service teacher training in scientific programming and computational thinking.
Thanks to Katrine, even though she cannot hear me right now, for exemplifying teacher training in the University of Oslo. If any of you have questions for Catherine, there is a chance that Thor can answer them since they work in the same center. Last presenter is Thor Ole Odden. He is a postdoc at the Center for Computing and Science Education at the University of Oslo. Thor will add to Katrine's presentation background on the University of Oslo, and he will present how the university have integrated computation into the math and science courses there, with a specific example from physics, and share what they have learned from their courses so far, hereunder what computation can add to university level education. Thor will give a concrete example of what they're doing, called computational essays. A computational essay is a hybrid computational project and writing assignment. All in all, he'll present how computation can have a solid role in university level higher education, and how learning computation is not only useful for the job market, but can also serve a role in educating future scientists and mathematicians, how it can fill in gaps with the current preparation, and how it can open up new opportunities for training students in authentic scientific practices. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much for that introduction, Elisa, and thank you all for being here. As Elisa said, my name is Thor. I'm a postdoc at a group called the Center for Computing in Science Education at the University of Oslo. And I want to talk about a little bit about sort of the third step in this learning progression that we're laying out. We've heard a little bit about the elementary level from Iman and teacher training there. We've heard a little bit about sort of secondary level. And I want to talk a little bit about what computational integration looks like at the university level. So before I go any further, I just want to say that the work I'm going to be talking about here is a collaboration between a large number of researchers, both at my institution and internationally. Here are a few of the wonderful people who are involved in that, including Katrine, who we just heard from. So when I talk about the work that we are doing, that's not the royal we, that is we as in this group. And the work I'm going to be describing here takes place, as mentioned, at the University of Oslo, where both Katrine and I work. One of the things that I appreciate about IDISI taking place in Norway this year, even if it's digital, is that hopefully most of you should be able to point to where Norway is located on a map of Europe. If you're having any trouble, it is right here. And more specifically, this is roughly where Oslo is located, a few hours south of Trondheim by train. So at the University of Oslo, we've had a focus on integrating computation into science and math courses since the early 2000s. And in practice, what this means is that if you were to come to the University of Oslo and enroll in a degree program to become a mathematician or a scientist, you would most likely take a programming and numerical modeling course during your first semester, either together or separately. The programming is typically done in Python and gives students a crash course in the basics of object-oriented programming. The numerical modeling focuses heavily on solving disciplinary problems. So solving the types of problems that you would use computation for in math and science. This sort of base of programming plus numerical modeling during the first semester means that subsequent courses and subsequent instructors can assume a pretty broad base of computational literacy on the part of the students. They can assume that the students have some experience programming and that they have a few tools in their toolbox for how to grapple with scientific problems. And that allows those instructors to build programming-based problems into their subsequent homework assignments and assessments. And as previously mentioned, we've also got my group, the Center for Computing in Science Education, which focuses on studying the effects of programming on students' understanding of math and science, and also sort of pushing the boundaries of what's possible to do with programming and what kinds of things we can have students do. So a question that you're probably reasonably asking and that we basically ask ourselves every day is, what does computation add to the teaching of math and science? And Katrina gave us some sort of previews in her talk just now. But I think the big message so far is that this is a pretty open question. It's a big and rich area of research. And it's not something that I can give you a definitive answer to. I can only provide you with some sort of glimpses and some threads that we're pulling on right now in our research area. So for example, one of the things that we see over and over is that computation opens up possibilities for solving difficult scientific problems, especially problems that would be inaccessible to students in sort of their early years in a discipline without the use of programming and computation. So for example, in my home discipline of physics, you very quickly learn that there are certain problems that are basically impossible to solve with the analytical tools that you learn in your first few semesters. One of the classic examples is the three-body problem. This is the problem of three different planets or stars interacting gravitationally, or three objects with mutual forces between them. And it turns out that while it's pretty straightforward to solve for the motion of two bodies, three bodies is basically intractable. There is no good closed form solution. But this is a very simple situation to simulate computationally. And so by introducing computation into the disciplines, students are able to, during their first few semesters, grapple with these types of complex problems that would normally be outside of their reach. In areas like biology, you see cases like complex population dynamics that would be very, very difficult to solve analytically, but are again pretty easy to simulate and pretty straightforward to analyze computationally. Another thing that we're finding is that computation can be a tool to help students engage in authentic scientific inquiry. So by that I mean computation allows students to define and follow up on their own research questions. Normally the ways in which we teach math and science in sort of a traditional manner involve students solving a lot of problems that only have one right answer and only a couple of possible routes to that single answer. But once you give students access to computation and give them sort of a basic set of tools to use it, they're able to define their own research questions and their own research problems and engage in activities and practices that are a lot closer to what you see actual researchers in math and science using. Related to this, we also are seeing that computation can be a way in which we can help redistribute epistemic agency to students. By epistemic agency, I mean basically giving students control over the learning process. So one theme from computer science, and one thing that you see a lot once students learn how to program, is that they're able to teach themselves new skills in sort of a way that isn't necessarily the case in traditional math and science teaching. And by giving students access to computation and programming, we can basically allow them to take control of the learning process themselves and define new questions and learn new ways to grapple with those questions. So I want to give you an example of what this looks like in practice in the form of a teaching tool that we're developing at my group called a computational essay. Computational essay, as Elisa foreshadowed earlier, is a hybrid computational scientific modeling and writing project. So here's an example computational essay. This was written by a student in one of our courses on a simulation of how to trap highly charged particles in a magnetic trap called a magnetic bottle. Many of you will right away notice that this is written in a Jupyter notebook, which is to say it's a programming environment that allows you to mix together narrative text and live code input and output. So the reason we call it a computational essay is because it bears a lot of the features that you would normally think of in sort of a standard essay. It has a title and introduction. It has text and equations since it's in physics, pictures and diagrams. It aims to lay out an argument or tell a story. But it also includes these blocks of live executable code, like importing Python packages for scientific modeling and graphing. Defining model parameters. If we were to scroll down, you would see simulation of the motion of charged particles and graphs of that motion over time. And so basically what we've been doing is giving students a challenge like the following. Use a computational simulation to investigate a problem that you find interesting, then write a computational essay about what you've learned in sort of this style that I've just shown. And we've been deploying these across several different math and science courses at the University of Oslo. One thing that's really interesting to see when you give students this kind of open-ended challenge is the types of questions that they choose to pursue. So a few examples of these. So for instance, one of the things that we've done is give students some example essays that they can sort of read and build off of in order to get a feeling for what these kinds of things look like, including an example of a railgun simulation. And we see students taking these simulations and remixing them and building them off of them in order to analyze how you could use a railgun to send a satellite into orbit around the sun, or to accelerate aircraft to high velocities, or power a train line like the metro line here in the city of Oslo, or to get a student to class on time by launching them from their dorm room through the roof of the lecture hall. We also see students coming up with questions that we had no idea they were thinking about, like can you use magnetic fields in order to do automated car lane control for self-driving cars? Turns out not very well if you want to have a smooth ride. And questions that are of personal interest and relevance, like simulating the Northern Lights, which I think just about every Norwegian is fascinated by. And there are many, many more of these kinds of questions. If you're interested in seeing a few examples, we've got an online showroom for these computational essays, which you can get to by following this QR code. I'll also show it at the end of the presentation. I also just want to say a little bit about this theme of epistemic agency and authenticity. One of the things that we've been doing is interviewing our students after they have written these computational essays to sort of understand what the experience was like. And a theme from that is that students report that working with computation in this way feels a lot more creative and authentic than the normal ways in which they learn math and science. So for example, here's a particular juicy quote from a student who had just written a computational essay. He says, "I take these subjects because they don't require anything from me in a way. I can just solve the problems and be done with it, and that's comfortable. But the fact that it requires some creativity is it maybe becomes closer to the way it is to actually do physics. And I feel like this assignment here, that is, it recreates the situation wherein one has to invent something, one has to find something to figure out in a way. It's not often that we encounter that in our STEM courses here, so it's a little bit of a breath of fresh air, creatively speaking. I just want to highlight the fact that this student, and he's far from the only one, seems to have a sense that the ways in which he and others are learning math and science doesn't necessarily bear a lot of resemblance to the ways in which professionals do math and science. Learning in this traditional mode is not necessarily authentic, but by introducing computation, we can bring things one step closer to disciplinary authenticity. And so to kind of wrap up, the big thing that we're finding is that computation can definitely serve a key role in higher education, math, and science. It can help students grapple with these problems. It can make it more creative and authentic. But in order to get these benefits, it has to be integrated into the disciplines. It's not enough to have a single course in, say, computational physics or bioinformatics or something like that, or a single computer science co-requisite, because you don't get this deep engagement, this deep connection between computation and programming and the disciplines in which it's situated. So with that, I'll say thank you very much for listening. Here are my references, which you'll be able to come back and see later on, and another link to the computational essay showroom that I showed before. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the presentation, and thank you to all the panels for participating. Sadly, I'd have to wrap this up very quickly. This is now the time for the Q&As. Eliza, would you like to take over and handle the questions to the panelists?
Yeah. So we have a question here. Why did Norway choose to integrate computing into math, science, art, and music classes rather than simply creating a dedicated computing class?
It's a really good question. And I don't have a full answer because the answer is partially sort of political, but I think part of it comes down to this thing that Katrina mentioned earlier about the transfer hypothesis. The idea that if you create a dedicated programming or computing course, that will automatically mean that students will be able to use programming and computing in other disciplines. And one of the things that seems to be coming out of the research right now is that the ways in which we use computing in different disciplines kind of looks differently. You can't take a person with experience computing in physics and expect them to automatically be able to program in biology or program in math. And even if a person has a lot of experience in computer science, you can't just drop them into a physics research group and expect them to be able to solve the types of problems that are of interest there. So the goal here, I think, is basically to help students learn not just sort of how to program, but also different applications for programming. That's one piece of it. The other piece is that, as we all know, K through 12 courses are already packed to the gills with a lot of different content. And so squeezing in another course is kind of a difficult thing. It's much more tenable for a lot of instructors to sort of thread computation through and find the places in which it strengthens the discipline and kind of fits into an already pre-existing lesson rather than removing things and slotting it in.
Yes, thank you. And here's a question for Aman. Educators and scientists each provide a different interpretation of computational thinking. What is your interpretation? And is the introduction of CT in elementary schools mandatory? In how many states? And I see you already answered this question online.
So quickly, we focus on those 4 CT practices: abstraction, decomposition, patterns, and debugging. As the CT practices, because that emerged in our work with teachers and how we could integrate them into the classrooms. So really it was driven by our work with teachers and what they thought would be valuable for them. No, CT is not mandatory in the US, but as more and more states come up with CS standards, right, so the teachers are expected to implement those, but not really mandatory.
And one more question, how do we ensure that teacher professional development is equitable, i.e. teacher quality is not dependent on the resources, wealth of the school and students?
That's a great question from Jean. I think one of the challenges has been that since we want to work with school districts who have high population of students of color or have students who are economically disadvantaged, it's been a challenge because those are the schools that want to focus on math and literacy scores, test scores so much, and so we've had like 1 or 2 teachers who try this out. So we've been able to provide resources through our grant and some other resources from the university, buy them equipment, buy them, programs that they might need. But for a broader, systemic implementation of CT, we do need to think, whether test scores are the right, focus for our education system, at least in the U.S., because that's limiting our ability to go into those schools that we want to go in.
And one last question, I think there are some questions from Man that you already answered, but here's one more from Judith. Sorry, I may have missed it, but I'm not sure what is meant by scientific programming. Does it mean to program the solutions to mathematical problems like linear or differential equations that were mentioned? Are you able to answer that too?
Yeah, sure. So the way we're thinking of scientific programming is it's basically programming applied to scientific and mathematical questions. So the programming the solutions to linear or differential equations, that's definitely one of the ways in which we use scientific programming. Also data analysis, machine learning at sort of the higher levels. Basically anytime you are modeling or analyzing a data set or a system using programming, that would be scientific programming.
Thanks. So I think that we're running out of time now. To quickly wrap up this session, we've discussed computer science education in K16 education, and the common theme has been computation used in different disciplines and how computer science concepts and tools can enhance teaching, not only as a subject different from all other subjects, but cross-curricular. So thank you for seeing our panel session, and I hope to meet you in real life at a later time.